Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Asma Kazmi, and I'm a professor in the Art Practice Department and in the Berkeley Center for New Media. We're pleased to host Morehshin Allahyari's lecture today in Art and Design Mondays, which is a weekly series coordinated by the Office of Berkeley Art and Design, which is led by Associate Vice Chancellor Shannon Jackson. And we're particularly grateful to the Art and Design Office for supporting the staff and the space costs of the Berkeley Art Museum so that we can host our amazing speakers in this beautiful theater. I also want to add that today's event is presented in partnership with the Wiesenfeld Visiting Artists Lecture Series, which is part of the Art Practice Department, the Jacobs Institute for Design Innovation, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and Stanford University. Before we begin, I want to mention our next event, which is on April 1st. It's a lecture by a local new media artist named Rhonda Halberton. And that lecture will be here in this space at the same time at 6:30 p.m. So, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Morehshin Allahyari. She's an artist, activist, educator, and a curator. Morehshin was born and raised in Iran, and her practice explores the relationship between art, technology, and activism. By deploying digital fabrication, experimental animation, 3D printing, collaging, scanning, and archiving, she complicates the descriptor digital and breaks down the boundaries between the digital and the material world. In her work, a combination of methodologies and materialities are used to, quote, inspect petropolitical and poetic relationships between 3D printing, plastic, oil, techno-capitalism, and jihad. Morehshin thinks about technology as a philosophical toolset to reflect on objects and as a poetic means to document our personal and collective struggles. In her work, Morehshin reclaims traditional mythologies, historical artifacts, and female figures from North Africa and the Middle East by imaging their forgotten forms to fight against digital colonialism, which Morehshin describes as Western corporations profiting off of the cultural heritage of others. Morehshin is a co-author of the 3D Additivist cookbook in collaboration with writer and artist Daniel Rourke. She has been a part of numerous exhibitions, festivals, and workshops around the world, including the Venice Biennale of Architecture, the Pompidou Center, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal, Tate Modern, the Queen's Museum, the Powerhouse Museum, Dallas Museum of Art, and the Contemporary Art Museum of Houston, amongst other venues. She's been an artist in residence at the Carnegie Mellon University Studio for Creative Inquiry, Autodesk Pier 9 workshop here in San Francisco, and the Willem Flusser residency program for artistic research. Her commissions include Rhizome, the Whitney Museum of Art, and the Liverpool Biennial. Please join me in welcoming Morehshin Allahyari.
Hello, thank you for being here, and thank you so much to everyone who made this happen. I'm very honored to be here today. Okay, so today I want to talk about three major long-term projects that I've worked on in the last 4 years. I'll reflect on poetic and practical possibilities of technology, refiguration, digital colonialism, monstrosity, and myth thinking as major concepts for these projects. How can we use technology as a tool for political resistance, for personal and collective storytelling, for defining space and opening up potential? A position for outside that asks difficult questions and suggests alternative methods. Before I go on and talk about my work and all the concepts around it, I would like to start by showing you a video that is around 6 minutes. And somewhere in the middle of my talk, I will come back to this and talk about it more in depth. But for now, I'm just gonna play it. Can we get the lights?
She who saw all things in a broadband earth and beyond, and knew what was to be known. She who had seen what there was and had embraced the otherness. She to whom the image clung like a mirror, a display of crisis, and who dwelt together with a devised becoming. She knows and sees the unknown and lays them bare. She is the monstrous other, the dark goddess, the possessive jinn, the dividing persona, the alternative figure. She restores myth and histories, the untold and the forgotten, the misread and uneven, those of and from the Near East. She is an inventor and a destroyer. She prescribes and rejects. In her city there was no outside, yet doors remained open and unlocked. Her name is Huma, she who is of flame and blaze. She is a jinn made of smokeless and scorching fire, among a race created by Allah prior to humans. From the very day of her birth, she was responsible for common fever, the fever of fevers, as they called it. The heat she brings to the human body is a symptom of an underlying condition, not a condition itself. Out into the world, she comes to possess earth and humans alike. In the whole universe, there was none better, none whom she, Huma, could not best. She leads all the burnings, looking up from the sun. She is a demon with 3 heads, 2 identical, vaguely equine, one looking right and the other left, leveled within an infinite horizon to see the disaster above her. The 3rd head faces forward, above the other 2, looking into the future. Her open legs with bent knees and open arms, suppressing all creatures. Great in respect, a monster in her form, she is the sight of the warm globe and the slowly burning human. Her 3 talismans are encountered frequently. One to simply summon and invoke her, to call and conjure her, chanting her name 7 times in a row. She enters from the most unforeseen openings. She bubbles up and out of the deep, dark bowels of the earth, forcing the heat of the desert to all she will possess, in favor of the rotting and heated bodies, airs, rocks, and oceans. Her 2nd talisman is to both bring and treat the fevered skin. One no one could elude, one she's the most worshipped for. She then extends her body to make all temperatures equal, above the normal on all surfaces, for the dehydrated and the unsuffered from drought. To to rise and drop the existing catastrophe in all directions, from north to south and east to west. She looks into a reflection, giving a second self to her, one half cracking, the other nourishing the hosts. To colonize the colonizers, to occupy the occupiers. Of this body and these lands, she communicates with the diseased. She is a monster and should be. Her third talisman, one she's the most feared for, one that will collapse all actuals, is the infectious madness. Rooted from the incurable heat, leading into chronic hallucinations, causing irritability, causing convolutions, causing sea-level sweat. All men gone mad by Huma, and no son was left sane to his father. And the gods cried out from this image the return of the repressed, the underprivileged. She, Huma, who shatters the unjust subject to expose symptoms, causing delirium, causing alienation, causing horizontal difference, causing universal blurring, causing immediate cruelty of nature, all to give birth to a parallel world between the ill and the healthy flesh.
Okay, yes, that's back on. All right, give me 1 second, I'm just gonna switch. All right. Okay, so to start a little bit from my background and the past, perhaps 10 years of my practice as an artist, I've been really interested in the way that I can bring together these two worlds of art and activism. Thinking about art making as a process that can go beyond just aesthetics or just perhaps the walls of a gallery. How you can make an art or a kind of artwork that engage with political, social problems going outside, again, of the art system. This is one of my favorite quotes that I think does a really good job of perhaps summarizing this relationship I have with art making. And it's by Nina Simone. I don't know if anyone has watched this documentary called What Happened, Miss Simone. Anyone? Yeah, some of you, right. So if not, it's on Netflix, you should watch it. But in there, Nina Simone talks about this thing that she calls an artist's duty. She says, I don't know how someone can have access to platforms and have a way to share their voice, but not use that as a way to reflect on different political and social issues around us, or perhaps like amplify certain voices. And I connect with that a lot. Maybe part of that could be because of growing up in Iran. I think a lot of my friends around me that were artists, that were creators, did a lot of work that was political. And I think part of it is perhaps not having the privilege of not making this kind of work. So I think that's something that I've carried with me through many, many years of my practice, and also in relationship to technology, finding ways to connect all these points. And to sort of start with these, again, 3 major projects that I want to talk about, I think this is a good way to frame that. And this relates to digital fabrication, 3D printing, 3D scanning. And I think one of the first things that I was very curious about was this question: what does a radical use of digital fabrication look like? And what is radicality at this very time? So This is around 2015 when there was definitely a sudden hype in the growth and the development of 3D printing and 3D scanning technologies. And at that time, I started to work on a project that is called the 3D Additivist Manifesto and the 3D Additivist Cookbook, and also some of the research around digital fabrication and activism. And one of the questions that would constantly come up or people would ask whenever you would say 3D printing was this project. They would be like, have you heard about the 3D printed gun? Which was a project by Cody Wilson. And so the idea is that if you have access to this digital file, you can 3D print a gun that could potentially work. And I think, again, this was a position that I was very interested to move on from, to think about radicality and the use of technology as a radical act in a way that it does not connect to violence, right? Because I don't think violence is radical, especially at this very time with everything that we're experiencing. So how can you be provocative? How can you be actually radical without necessarily, connecting to something that is violent, that can create some hype around something? So with this project, additivism, which was a term that we coined, we sort of wanted to connect these two worlds of additive technologies and activism. So, and sort of we also went further and we thought about not just only the technology, but even additive processes, let's say knitting or weaving, and there's a long history of that in feminism movements, for example. So how additive technologies could connect to this idea of activism. And so for us, additivism became a community, it became a collective, it became ways to engage in this critical thinking of digital fabrication. At that time, I was also living in the Bay Area, and this is the time that I started to do an artist residency at Pier 9 at Autodesk. And I think a lot of hype and projects that I would see around 3D printing and 3D scanning was very much this banal binary way of thinking about this technology. There was no really criticality around it. And so I think this is the world we wanted to create. We wanted to be able to create not just a manifesto, but also a manifesto that called for people, designers, activists, artists, writers, etc., to submit their blueprints, recipes, projects, essays to us so that we could make this project, which is the 3D Additivist Cookbook. It's available online. If you're interested, you can look for it later. But it contains the work of over 100, again, artists, designers, activists that think about this technology not only as a way to activate certain political, social spaces, but also as a way to sort of reimagine the possibilities of the future, these science fictional, both dystopian and utopian ways of thinking about this technology. And around this time, I also started to do a lot of research around connecting 3D printing to plastic, to crude oil, which, as you know, it's a raw material for plastic, and then how that connects to techno-capitalism, oil as this politically political material, but also as a way, as a material that you can use as a point of departure for other symbolic thinking, and also to jihad. A lot of my projects prior to this also was about documenting and archiving. So how through this process of documenting and archiving, you can decolonize certain spaces, you can share knowledge, and comment on different topics and issues. So around this time, this is 2015 again, this video of ISIS destroying the artifacts at Mosul Museum came out. Some of you might remember it. It was a video that went viral, and there was a lot of discussions around it. And it was a big shock. It was the first time that you saw this destruction of artifacts being documented so well, which of course was something that ISIS was interested in. But whenever I talk about this, I would like to also say and mention that around this time and before this, a decade before this, for many years, U.S. military also was destroying a lot of these artifacts and cultural sites in the Middle East in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's very interesting because the reaction sort of toward this video, because this violence was so, out there, it was so shocking, it was so direct and bold, right? They're like, we're gonna do this, we're gonna destroy this, and we're gonna document it. Versus, let's say, US military, which for many, many years have been destroying these sites and also like killing people, etc. But you hardly can find any documentation of this, right? So their way of dealing with that is a much more like hidden, pushed in some background corner violence that is invisible to a lot of people. So while working on this project, I realized that there's a lot of research that needs to be done. And I sort of like think about it now, and it feels like thinking that I'm gonna swim in a pool, and then it turned into ocean, literally. And some of you who might have a practice that is like more like art-based and maybe not very research-based know that like as artists we do research, but this project was definitely the beginning of like very intense research that was very new to me. So I started to contact a lot of historians, a lot of scholars who were doing research around the Middle East or this era, which is mostly Assyrian era, which the artifacts that were destroyed at Mosul Museum in Iraq were part of. And one of the complications with this project was the lack of information. So I was doing this research in Farsi and Arabic and English, and I would, let's say, like find some information about an artifact in English, and then I would like compare that to some old material in Arabic, and things wouldn't match up. There were a lot of discussions around how some of the artifacts that were destroyed at the museum were copies and not original, which later was not true. Most of them were original, but I wanted to find out what was what before I start to work on this project. Which is the reconstruction of these artifacts. So I reconstructed 12 of these artifacts, and that's what I want to talk about right now. That process of lack of information also existed with these images that were available from the artifacts. If some of you might be familiar with software like 123D Catch or Memento. These are software that, let's say if you have access to 25, 30 images from different directions from an object and they're pretty good quality, you can use these still images and create a 3D model. But again, because of the lack of information, like imagine in the last like 30 years, how many tourists have been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also like how many of these artifacts have been documented, very little number of them. So again, this process of using 3D scanning was not possible because they were already destroyed, and these other ways of 3D modeling them was not possible. So the other option was to reconstruct them with a group of students. This is again during my residency at Pier 9. With a group of students and as accurately as possible based on images that we had at that time. So these are the first two artifacts that I worked on, King Uthal and the unknown king of Hatra. And so inside each artifact, I've also included memory cards and flash drives that contain all the research that I've done around them. So this includes PDF files, images, the process of making the work, my email correspondence with the scholars and historians, as well as STL OBJ files, which are standard files for 3D printing of all the artifacts. And at this point of making this work, I was really thinking about this project and these sculptures as time capsules. How can we like keep this information sort of in both practical and poetic ways for future civilizations? And so I'm just going to go through it really quick and show you some of these images. I also wanted to find a way that I would give access to this information, this research that I had done to everyone at this very, very moment in time. And I started to work on a project with RISM and New Museum in 2016, where I released a folder, a zip folder, for free as an open source, and it contains again like all the research, all the material that are in the sculptures, and one of the STL OBJ files of King, which is from King Uthal, and I will come back to this in a bit, explaining why I only have released one of the objects so far. And I also recently added these like 3 heads, these were the 3 heads that were outside of the Mosul Museum, and they were destroyed. But I expanded them again as like other forms of knowledge sharing. So these can be like installed in different places, different locations, and there is a USB that is connected to them, and people can connect their hard drives or their computers to get the information from the objects. But as I continued this work and I was like developing this project, and more like toward the end of it, there were a lot of projects that started to come out from especially institutions and different companies based in Silicon Valley that were doing this kind of reconstruction work. So, you know, the project I did like got a lot of press and attention, so a lot of people knew about it, and I would constantly get like messages or emails, people being like, hey, have you seen this project? It really reminds me of yours. And the more I kind of saw these projects, the more I got like curious about what's exactly happening with these reconstruction projects, why these institutions are interested to go and whether like 3D scan these you know, like historical sites or like do this kind of like reconstruction work. And so this is where I started to become interested in this concept of digital colonialism, a term that I have coined and developed in the last 3 years. And I recently, around 2 weeks ago, did a performance lecture at New Museum called Physical Tactics for Digital Colonialism, where I talk about a lot of layers and connections and concepts in relationship to this project. And today I will get to talk about some elements of it. But I was interested to know, you know, sort of like not only why these institutions are doing this, but what is happening to the access, like what is happening to the ownership and the copyright of these digital files. So again, what's happening is that a lot of these institutions are going to the Middle East, different parts of Africa, etc., and then they 3D scan these cultural and historical sites and artifacts. And then they have ownership of it. They make money of it. They make benefit of it. They promise, a lot of them on their websites, this is from a project called SciArc in Oakland. They promise on their website that this is a project in which they are like giving access and doing this kind of work as a way to save the shared universal heritage. But when you go to their website, there are only very small number of actually like information 3D scans that you can have access with. But also there is a lot of things to think about around the language they use as a way to justify these kind of like projects. So they also give private access only to certain objects. They sell a lot of these like models. And so for me, that was something that I was like interested in questioning, how these like positive acts of saving the world's cultural heritage are problematic in so many ways when you start to like think about it actually critically. I think this is a really good way to bring together these two connections between, you know, physical colonialism that we understand, you know, perhaps like easier, and then this concept of digital colonialism. So let's say you walk into the Met or British Museum, and then you see, you know, some artifact somewhere, and if you want to think about it critically, you know, there could be a whole like Middle Eastern section or like, you know, East Asia. You can question, right, like where these objects came from, how many of these objects were like taken and brought to these places by permission. And I would say if you dig into the history of these objects, a lot of them were basically like stolen, taken without permission. And this is a good example of the Nefertiti bust, for example, which was taken by a group of German architects. And for the last decades, there has been this back and forth sort of battle between the Egyptian government and the German government asking the German government to send this back, and they're like, no, we own it, and they're like, you never got permission to take it, and we want it back, but the German government is not sending it back. And then recently, 2 years ago, there was a project where these artists, these two Egyptian artists, wanted access to this like high quality 3D scan of the Nefertiti bust, and the museum was not giving them access. and saying that no, this is like we have this like file, but we only use it for like private uses. So they did this project where they went to the museum and then used a 3D scanner, sort of like guerrilla style performance, and 3D scanned the Nefertiti bust and then released the file online. There's some, you know, sort of like discussions around if they really, if they could actually had scanned it that high quality, because the scanner they use is Connect, and some, you know, geek guy went through it and like explained that you cannot scan this high quality thing using this scanner. But, you know, so, I mean, I'm friends with them, and there's like discussions around like if they got the file from someone at the museum, sort of, who gave it to them. Anyway, I mean, like not with permission. But which regardless, make this still an amazing project, because it raised a lot of questions, again, around this like relationship between physical and digital ownership. And also, if you go to this website and the new museum in Germany, where they own the actual physical object, you can buy this high quality sort of recreation of it for 8,900 euro. You can choose up to 10 of them. So, which is pretty fascinating, right? And like ridiculous that, like, I mean, they're making so much like profit of it, not just from the visitors every day paying money to go to the museum and see the Nefertiti bust, but also this kind of like profit from the digital and then the scan and then the accurate recreation of it. So not only these are the questions that need to be asked about this kind of work, but there is also...
And it is with great, great pleasure, therefore, that I hear...
Oops, no, I'll go back to that. But so there's also another question, which goes back to this like question of shared heritage. So what is shared heritage? What is universal heritage? I think that's also a concept that has been used for so many, many years as a way to colonize other cultures. That's kind of the language that SciArt or Google Art and Institute, Art and Culture Institute use on their website. They're like, these are the shared culture and shared history, and we want to save it. But is it really shared history? And again, the language that they use sort of justifies it. Here in a video that I'm going to show you now, this video is sort of a remake of an actual video that shows the launch of this project called Palmyra in London, where they reconstructed this site that was destroyed in Syria. And then you see Boris Johnson talking about how they are reconstructing this from the hand of the barbarian who destroyed it. So basically, not only we have this problem of white savior here, but also how these like political figures remove themselves, and like many other people talking about these projects, remove themselves from, you know, the relationship that they have with, let's say, the formation of ISIS in first place. ISIS was created because of US military and invasion and Europe invasion in the Middle East. But sort of through just standing there and becoming these heroes who are saving this cultural heritage, they completely remove that influence that they've had in the formation of ISIS in first place, and many, many other layers of like problematic sort of representation that, you know, gets lost. But I love this video because it does
this. And it is with
this.
great, great pleasure, therefore, that I hereby unveil the oldest new structure in the history of this city. Ladies and gentlemen, the Triumphal Arch of Palmyra. 3, 2, 1.
So this was by this artist, Ryan Woodring, and I think it's so simple, but also that act of removing it really questions, right, that power structure. Okay, so, and to sort of end the material speculation ISIS part, and that sort of like connecting it to all these like things around digital colonialism, one reason that I have not released other files of these like 3D files of the other artifacts, as I mentioned, I've only released one, which is King Uthal, is because I'm trying to figure out a place, and I've been in conversation with multiple museums in the Middle East where I can give access and ownership of those files back to Mosul Museum or a museum in Iraq. And I am so glad that I made that decision at that time, because I think at a time, I was also being naive about this concept of open source. Perhaps part of it was because I was looking at a lot of these institutions and seeing how they were like making profit of these files and then this information they had. And I wanted to give free and open access so that that would go against these acts of like digital colonialism. But after like now 3 years of going back and like looking at it, I really think open source is also something that we need to question. So with like King Uthal, when I like released it, what happened was that people who would like 3D print it or like had access to that technology to like 3D printed were all based in developed countries, in Western countries, right? We're experiencing this problem with digital gap where a lot of people in the Middle East or some other countries don't necessarily have the same kind of like access to these technologies. So really it was a question for myself that who am I releasing these files for, right? And what does that mean really in this context? So for now, I've like hold on to this, and I think my dream would be to sort of have it all back at Mosul Museum. That's something that I'm in conversation with right now and trying to figure out. This is a project that I have also been working on for the last almost 2 years, a research-based project called She Who Sees the Unknown. The video that I showed from at the beginning of my talk is from this series, in which I am going back and looking at these dark goddess, monstrous, gen female or like genderless queer figures from the Middle East. And sort of like looking for these figures that are forgotten or misrepresented in histories. And then taking them out and sort of repositioning them, telling new stories about them. And all these figures are also figures that are from the Middle East and North Africa. So, you know, one thing that I was really interested in, and I've been, I think, interested in last, like, especially like 4 years, is this non-binary relationship between technology and history. Sort of, I think about this project in some ways as a continuum of the work that I was doing with material speculation, ISIS, in a very different way, but also in a similar way. So when you think about superheroes, you know, when you hear about superheroes and their stories, whether it's here in different like Western countries, or like my case of like growing up in Iran and always reading about these like male superhero figures that are like very powerful, they could win all the battles, this, that, and you hardly ever come across figures that are female, right? So I have always been interested in like this like absence, like why there's this absence. I mean, we know why, but at the same time, how to break through that absence. One of the figures that I've been really interested in is this figure of the Jinn. And I'm gonna refer to it as Jinn because anytime I say genie, it reminds me of the Aladdin movie or whatever. So the Jinn is a figure that is like very specific. It's a figure that is in the Quran. It's known as shapeshifter. And, you know, there are like different figures in the Quran. There's like human, angel, devil, and then the Jinn. And, you know, angels obey, devil disobeys, and human and jinn are the only figures that are capable of making decision. So you can use a jinn as a friend, you can befriend them and then use them to possess other spaces and people. They can, again, disobey or obey and make those decisions. I think that makes them a very interesting figure, right? And there's like so much potential also, especially for me because I think working with figures, I was always like looking for figures that are very specific to like perhaps, you know, whether Islamic culture or my experience of like growing up in Iran. So Jinn is not only in the Quran, but it's a figure that is talked about constantly in like daily life experiences. Like my grandmother would always say that she has seen, she sees like different jinn whenever she goes to the public bath, a house, and like they like humid and dark places. So they're very much part of the Middle Eastern culture, not just Iran, but like many different parts of it. And so I use this figure of the jinn as a way to think about different forms of colonialism, patriarchism, and environmental catastrophe. I also talk about this concept, and this is like also another term that I've been like developing called refiguring or refiguration. How refiguring can be this position of activism and decolonizing as a feminist position. And this is one of my favorite quotes by Donna Haraway, which she says, figures collect up hopes and fears and show possibilities and dangers, both imaginary and material. Figures root peoples in stories and link them to histories. And I think that is what makes this like act of refiguring really powerful for me. So material speculation ISIS and She Who Sees the Unknown are both not only about this like non-binary connection between history and technology, but also in both of them, there's this refiguration, which for me is about activation and preservation. It's an act of going back, especially with She Who Sees the Unknown, and retrieving the forgotten or destroyed histories, from the ones destroyed by ISIS in 2015 to the female queer figures from very old Middle Eastern mythical and ancient narratives and texts that are usually misrepresented. So for me, refiguring is a position of going back and reimagining the past so that we can create and reimagine alternative new futures and worlds, so that we can collapse the political notion of linear space and time as an act of resistance. Refiguring as a ficto, feminist, and activism practice to reflect on the effects of historical and digital colonialism and other forms of oppression and catastrophe. With the video of Huma that I showed you, when I read her story, and again, these are stories that are not popular, like it takes a lot of like digging to find them. And she's known as a jinn that brings fever and heat to human body and the planet. I really loved this image of like her power as this power that brings fever, that brings heat. But I was really interested in sort of like this idea of her coming to bring this heat is also a way for her to create some kind of like justice around the crisis of global warming. Whenever people talk about global warming, I think it's really easy to get lost in how much of it is still a very Western or developed country-dominated conversation. And not only as a problem, but also the solutions to it. And also whenever a catastrophe happens, who are the people who are gonna be left behind, right? I mean, like if you think about the Katrina hurricane, like people who were left behind, people who didn't have access, or people who were lower class, or like people of color, Black people. So thinking about sort of catastrophe in that sense, when the global warming hits and we're all dying, like Elon Musk gets to go to the Mars, but who will be left behind, right? So that's what she comes to do. And with this project, this is an installation of her. So each of these figures that I work on, they have an installation. Sort of, I built a shrine-like space for them, where as an audience you enter and you experience some kind of space very specific to that figure. And I also built an archive that currently doesn't exist. It's still in progress. Archive of these, again, monstrous female figures that contains images, text, etc. A lot of that material is in Arabic and Farsi. And then I create these reading rooms in the exhibition spaces where the audience can come and sit and engage with this material. I also do a lot of events as part of this work. This is a series called Hamneshini, which the direct translation from Farsi is sitting together. So literally sitting together in the most like casual way and talking and discussing different topics. This was an event at IBEAM where I was doing a residency in New York, and I invited 3 of my friends and artists and thinkers and scientists, all from the Middle East, and we sort of like talked about different topics in relationship to refiguring. And then this is a performance series that I've just started, where again we explore other ways of thinking about these concepts, these like performance lectures as a way to connect again to topics beyond just the act of like art making or like making and sculpture. This is the original image, one of the original illustrations of Huma. These are all from really old, again, material that goes from 1400 years ago to 500, 600 years ago. And I already talked about this, but sort of like closing down that whole discussion about Huma, I really love this quote also by Sarah Ahmed, which she says, privilege is a buffer zone, how much you have to fall back on when you lose something. Privilege does not mean we are invulnerable, things happen, shit happens. Privilege can, however, reduce the costs of vulnerability. So if things break down, if you break down, you're more likely to be looked after. And so I think for me, somewhere in my head, I wanted Huma to come, and if we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die together. So she brings an equal justice to that dystopia, if you will. And then this is the story of Aisha Gandisha. She's a jinn, she's a Moroccan jinn, and she's known as the opener. She's very seductive. And her story is that when she comes and possesses humans, mostly men, she creates a crack on their body. She literally like opens them up to an incoming data of other demons and jinn. And the only way to not go insane when you're possessed by her is to participate with her, is to listen to her. So she's like very powerful in that way. And I tell, a story about toxic masculinity and love, etc. in this. All these videos are also on my website, so I'm happy to give you the password later so you can watch it. But because also this work is still in progress, it's for now password protected. Okay, 2 more figures. This is Ya'juj Ma'juj, and their story is also told in the Quran. So they're a group of people, a community or a group of individuals, and they represent chaos. So I came across this story after the Muslim ban happened. And when the ban happened, I had left the US to go do a talk and like an exhibition in Berlin, and the ban happened. And at a time, I had a green card and my Iranian passport. And if you remember the beginning of the ban, green card holders were like also included. So for like 10 days, I was in Germany, and I've lived in the US for 10 years, and it just felt like everything I had was like so fragile, that everything I have done and I've created could all go back to zero just like that, and I was privileged enough to go back because I had the green card, but of course it's the story of like many people since then, of like being banned and rejected and not having access. And I came back and I came across this story, which is that they represent Ya'juj Ma'juj, they represent chaos, and a group of people from this like city asked this person Zulqarin to build an iron wall around the city to keep them out. And this sort of like apocalyptic Islamic perspective is that when they come and when they break through this iron wall is when we're going to experience some kind of ending, some kind of end of the world. And I found it really fascinating reading about this because there's so many interpretations of Ya'juj Ma'juj. Some say that, they were, they represent Turkish people who attacked Iran. A like contemporary sort of reading of them in different like texts and material is that they represent Israel. But through time it's always really interesting, like what's chaos and like how people have interpreted these stories. And in this case, and in tradition of the kind of research I was doing with Shiusis the Unknown, I, of course, wanted to use these figures as a way to embrace the monstrosity, right? That's part of what I'm doing with this body of work. Instead of thinking about monstrosity as like a negative position, and you might be able to like think about this like perhaps like in a more familiar way in sort of a lot of like feminism work that is coming out, where the image of the witch is being turned around, like witch as this like negative, ugly, old figure, but then embracing that and like turning around that relationship. And that's what I'm trying to do with a lot of these figures. That's why I'm interested in monstrosity and not the motherly, earthly goddess. So with this, I tell a story of Ya'juj Ma'juj, sort of the people and Ya'juj Ma'juj shift turns. They become chaos for them, and then sort of questioning who is left behind what wall, etc. And I think another thing that I want to say is that one other reason that I really loved this story and wanted to use it is because when especially at the beginning, when the stuff was happening with the ban, one conversation that would keep coming up, for me also, like on my like social media, etc., was that people would say things like, oh, but this person is so inspiring, they're so successful, this person is a lawyer, that person is a doctor, like they should like welcome this person back, of course. But I think that's such a dangerous conversation, that's such a dangerous way of thinking about this relationship between like borders and immigration, because nobody has to be successful or like inspiring to have the right to live anywhere. So again, I also wanted it to be like embrace this rejection and monstrosity, and then use it to tell stories. Oh, and then I have created also like a VR piece, which is like really weird and creepy, but like as an audience, you're in this space and this story is being told to you, and you participate by following their hand gestures as a way to let this story be told and continued. All right, this is the final figure I want to talk about, and then after this, I want to do a very little performance with this piece. So this was another gen figure that I came across and story. And it's the story of the laughing snake. I came across this image and I fell in love with it, just like how she's like illustrated. And up there in Farsi, it says the figure of the snake, the laughing snake, and the mirror. So her story is that she's this snake going around and killing all these people and eating all these humans, and nobody can win any battle with her. And then somebody comes out and say that the only way to kill her is to hold a mirror in front of her. You can see up there, there's like these like men holding a mirror. And so when she sees her reflection in the mirror, she starts laughing, and she laughs for days and nights until she dies from laughter. And so, again, I wanted to turn this around and think about laughter, think about that death, not as like a weakness, but as a point of like having agency and having control over your image. And, you know, at this time, I was like also thinking a lot about things that were happening around the Me Too campaign stuff. And I think although that was very powerful and it was like a really important collective moment, but again, it lacked the experiences of women from certain cultures, women of color in a lot of cases. And, you know, like sort of like thinking about growing up in Iran, I mean, like sexual harassment, right, like is a different experience in some ways, but also sexual desire, your relationship with your body. And the fact that there are these like men holding this like this mirror in front of her was like something that I like really wanted to like turn around. So I want to, oh, and then this is the installation of the Laughing Snake that is up right now in New York at the Hunter's College. If you happen to be there, it will be up for like some more weeks. And it's a mirrored room where you enter and then you see your reflection with her 3D printed figures, which is really big, installed from the ceiling, and then you can experience with the net art, this hypertext that I'm gonna now read for you and experiment. So, okay, for this I need your collaboration. I'm gonna switch, but while I do that, so this starts in as a, like, so it's hypertext again, narrative, and it starts as a linear story, but then there'll be at times that the words in yellow can be chosen, right? There are like 2 options or 3 options at a time. So if you could work with me and one at a time, I mean, it will happen organically, but choose one of the words and then I click on that. But you also have to remember to not repeat the same path, right? Because we want to end up in different parts of the story. Give me a second and pull this up. Okay. We're going to enter the project. Let's see.
She who saw all things in a broad earth and beyond, and knew what was to be known. She who had seen what there was, and had embraced the otherness. She to whom the image clung like a mirror, a display of crisis, and who dwelt together with a devised becoming. She knows and sees the unknown, and lays them bare. She is the monstrous other, the dark goddess,
it's really
the possessive jinn, the
okay, I'm
divine
gonna skip this part
persona.
because I don't want the light off and we can just skip it. All right. She's the laughing snake, known as the one mirrored. When it gets to 3 options, you can choose. She's daughter to no warrior, wife to no nobleman, Mother to no hero, she stands rootless yet rooted. The one displaced the same elsewhere. She's the destroyer of all occupiers, the killer of the people of no sky, capturing those with wings who do not fly, putting out every fire in favor of her own flame. Oh, wow. Her story is told at every edge of the world, a gen no one could elude, one time into the past and one time into the future. They prayed, "You have created this monster, now give her her equal." But no equal was found to fight her. No, we have to do one at a time. I can't. All eyes on her, they held a mirror in front of her. When she saw her reflection, she burst into laughter. She laughed for days and nights until she died. I'm 12 at school, and in our theory class, our teacher tells us that if we keep on not covering our hair completely under the scarf, on the last judgment day, God will hang us from each strand of our hair. And I have one of those disobedient heads with all my hair out. I raise my hand to say, I don't want to pray to a God that is that cruel. And I would get suspended from school for 2 days. And somehow for months and years since then, I keep imagining a scene where God is that caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland, and it's the last judgment day, and I'm hung from every single strand of my hair. And God says, "Explain yourself." And I laugh hysterically to say, "I'm afraid I can't explain myself because I'm not myself, sir." آنقدر از هم فاصله داریم 1000 بار هم که بگویم نخواهی فهمید. از بین زمین و آسمان تو روی زمین بمان دور. بگذار آسمان حد و مرز من باشد. All eyes on her, they held a mirror in front of her. When she saw her reflection within the world, she burst into laughter from the image, them holding a mirror. She laughed hysterically for days and nights until she died. And I will be standing on a stage, and there will be a ceremony, and I will be raising my head, and I will see a lineup of hundreds, thousands, millions of girls, and they will each hold a safety pin up to the air. And one girl will come forward to give me my own, and she will whisper into my ear, "Carry this with you everywhere you go." And this will become the weapon of my generation. And in Farsi, we call safety pin sanjaq qufli, which translates to locking, securing pin. And years later, when I learned the word in English, and I won't stop thinking about the uncanny coincidence of words and objects. And our stories we were too ashamed to share. And years later, from this future, none of this will even be a thing. And won't this be our revolution? 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 Laugh at the revolution unless it's our revolution. I'm 16, I'm 17, I'm 18, I'm 19, I am 20, I'm 21, I'm 22. And please know that I'm just existing, walking around in the streets of Tehran in pants with a long manteau covering all my body and a scarf, taking the public taxi, standing in some line, taking the bus, sitting down somewhere, and young boys, middle-aged fathers, old grandpas, casually. catcall me every single day, to tell me what a nice piece of pussy I am, to tell me I want to fuck you and your mother, to tell me you look like a whore with that makeup, to tell me I can put my dick inside your ass if you want to stay a virgin. And young boys, middle-aged father, old grandpas, casually touch my lap and my breast and my ass, rub their penis on me in some crowded place, follow me for blocks at night, forcing me to get their number, and young boys, middle-aged fathers, old grandpas, casually ask for directions and show their penis in the car before driving off laughing, walk to me and whisper, if you waited right here at the bus station, I will come back to pick you up after dropping my daughter. He points out to his daughter sitting in the car, and she's my age. And young boys, middle-aged fathers, old grandpas, casually make it to my nightmares, my subconscious, somewhere deep in my soul, and young boys, middle-aged fathers, old grandpas, casually repeat into each other. Okay, thank you. There's so many more sections to this, so I hope you will get to go and read the rest if you're interested. So I guess we're doing Q&A now? Yes. So I'm only going to answer questions that are questions and not comments, and also that are related. So.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicholas DeMoncho, Director of the Berkeley Center for New Media. This is our Berkeley Center for New Media microphone. As you may tell, it's squishy, it's cute. Please don't throw it, but you may pass it back and forth. Our ushers will bring it to you, and you need to hold it right up to your face like this, which is designed to help you remember that you're asking a question. Raise your hand, otherwise you won't know to bring it to you.
Hello. Thank you for that. It was fantastic. Really. I just wanted to ask about the text that you just read. And I mean, I'm assuming you've written all of it yourself, but are there sources for it that belong to the mythologies that those jinn are based on, or not?
No, I mean, everything that I read is just, personal stories, and also, I guess, collective experiences. Only like the beginning where I'm talking about the laughing snake, where I'm like explaining what she is. That part is obviously from the story that I just said about her. But then also part of it is like I'm creating another possibility in which like equal and not equal, right? And then two things happen. So that other part from there, it also all like made up. Yeah, so it's just sort of fact fiction, but all the stories that I read are what I've written.
Hi. So right here. I noticed that at one of the endpoints on the Laughing Snake project, you read a paragraph in Farsi. Would you be able to translate that, or do you remember what it was?
I mean, I can give you, I won't remember like word by word to translate. So it says, oh my God, I have to like now go back and like look at it. So it's sort of like, the concept is like, doesn't matter how much you feel like you're close to me, or like it's sort of playing around with this idea of the sky and the earth, but you will never understand this position. So it's kind of like that, right? But like, yeah, it's talking about like distance and like ground, and the fact that we're not standing on the same ground, something around that.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. I really enjoyed your lecture. I'm an Egyptologist and I work on 3D visualizations, printing, and I'm also writing a book on demonology in ancient Egypt where I compare ancient Egyptian demons with genes. So this was really exciting. So I have two questions. One is about the use of 3D prints, replicas, for protests, like the bust of Nefertiti. And I wonder what you think about those replicas having a life of their own. So in that project, they bring back Nefertiti in the sense of Egypt. And also one of the questions was for the museum in Berlin to actually own just the digital print and give back the original. And they didn't want to. So that was something non-acceptable. At the same time, they're selling the replica for a ridiculous amount of money. So I wonder what you think about the value of the replica compared to the original, which is also a project I'm working on for other objects, and about those beautiful visualizations of the genes. I see most of them are the 2D representations, so drawings that you then make in 3D. And so my feeling is that you're creating new pieces, new arts. They have a life on their own. In a sense, they differ from the original. So in what way you think they are different and unique?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, with material speculation ISIS, it was very much about trying to reconstruct these artifacts as closely as possible, as accurately as possible. I mean, of course, there's really no way to replace them when they're lost, but that was just like a gesture as a way to have some kind of resource point of departure to keep this memory. But with Who Sees the Unknown, it's very much about reappropriation, it's about recontextualization. So I am sort of giving myself a bit more of like freedom and authority to like recreate them and reimagine them and like change things around and move things around. So yeah, I just think like they were like two different projects in the way that I was like approaching recreation. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the electronic files in like a SD card inside the actual statues, how the thought about does that going to last for 10 years or 20 years, and the thought to remove it, or that they know to remove it, or that they see it because it's a glass file, or I mean a glass article.
What do you mean by they?
Well, I guess the person that would want to take the electronic file and then make a new one.
Right. I mean, so, you know, I mean, the idea of that, as I was saying at that point, was like this idea of like time capsules, like that they would be like kept, but for the future. But at the same time, the way I've like designed it, you know, there's like a hole in the artifact when it gets, or in the sculpture when it gets 3D printed. So and then I like create like this like a bit of like a plug, and I seal it with the same resin material, meaning that it won't be like easy to have access to it, but you don't also have to like destroy the artifacts to have access to it. Yeah, so, and then the decision to have it as like transparent was because I was also really interested in this like digital physical sort of connection between this work, but also because, again, research was really important in the work that I was doing. I wanted that like that archiving, saving on this like material to become part of like how someone aesthetically would experience the piece. So it was not just some like reconstructed sculpture of the piece, but like something more, and there would be like more layers to it.
Hi, this is a strange object. Thank you so much, Morehshin. That was incredible.
Thank you.
I had a question about the representation of Arab and Irani males in your work, and I was wondering if you could speak about that, because you know I'm thinking about this last work where you know you're talking about sort of these catcalling vulgar men, and then the image of the ISIS men. So I'm wondering if there's a space for a more nuanced representation of men, especially when Arab men come with so much baggage.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's a very complicated space, right? Like, even working on anything that relates to religion in that sense at this time, right? Like, how do you, because, you're sort of like stuck always between these two positions where like, like I grew up like under like this like oppression of like hijab and scarf when I didn't want to wear it and you're forced to do it. But then you come here and then you see that being used as like, Islamophobia as a way to then like kill Muslims, etc. So I think it's like really complicated. In Aisha, I'm definitely talking about a white man. And like I also talk about, like other like positions, like, when I talk about ISIS, I always talk about like US military. I always talk about the position of like white men. I always talk about white savior. Like even when I did like the ISIS project, because I felt like as someone, people were just like focusing on ISIS, and that's like so easy, then whenever I would like do interviews and like anytime that like there was a time to like talk about it, I would always bring this other position in. And I really do think about also my artist talks as this place to like raise these questions. I don't like give artist talks that are just about my artworks, but I really like try to challenge all these like elements. So for me, it's like I don't want to like be dishonest about like my experience of growing up in Iran, which was in some sense oppressive, but at the same time I also don't want to like use that only as a way to like talk about this. And so I always like try to like balancing out with like, again, like talking about this position of like white savior, digital colonialism, and like other stories. This piece especially was really hard because it was the first time I was like really wanted to write about my experiences of like sexual harassment and like sexual desire. And I mean, there are a lot of parts in here that was like really actually like uncomfortable to write about because it's just like about sexual desire, which was like a big taboo, and I always like wanted to do a piece about it. So when I was working on it, definitely I was like always like thinking about like how to like work on this project while then, for this, as you're saying, this like position of like the brown man doesn't become like only the focus. But so yeah, I think like I would balance that out by like making work that also positions like other forms of toxic masculinity that is not only like focus on, in this case, let's say Arab and Middle Eastern men.
Thank you. That was really a great talk. I wonder, to go back to the beginning, if you could talk more about the materiality of oil in relation to the 3D printing. I know that you referenced it, but I was so fascinated with everything else you're saying, I'm not sure I made all the connections.
So sort of I was like doing a lot of like reading and research. I was especially very inspired by this book called Secondopediya, Complicity with Anonymous Material by Reza Negarstani, where he talks about oil and like uses oil as a metaphor, but also as like a liquid that has the potential to connect a lot of like poetics, fictional, factual like elements. So with this, when I was like doing this research, I was like reading that and I was like connecting it to sort of how plastic, that is the most used material in like 3D printing, especially at that time, comes from this raw material, it comes from oil, and then how that gets heated and shaped into these objects. And then, again, like this like connection with oil, which is like, it's sort of between it's been like this unwinnable war basically between the techno-capitalism and like, the Middle East and the economy around that. So all those elements, it was just like some connections that I was like pointing at each other, and I was like interested in connecting and then sort of taking that out and then working on a project that would use that as metaphor.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about the reinterpretation of the witch thing that you mentioned. I was wondering where the whole idea comes from, and if you could just talk about it a tiny bit more, like what's the idea?
I mean, there are a lot of different feminist theories, you know, not only also which, like the cyborg is like sort of like a dark figure, right, in certain ways like dystopian and also utopian. But like there is, you know, I could tell you like that is like Donna Haraway, but like Rosie Braidotti has done like a lot of like writing around like monstrous and like witches. There are a lot of like performances, you know, again, like it's more in like feminist theories of like using that image as, again, a position for like turning around power structures. So I would say a lot of like feminist theories.
Hi, I just had a question about your comment or this idea of like fever and like its connection to climate change, because I think it's a really interesting like reframing when you're putting it in the context of like this idea of monstrosity and like the djinn. Like, could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I was again like using the dark, sort of the monstrous figure of Huma as a way to like, you know, like imagine, you know, sort of like dystopian, like through horror thinking and dystopian thinking, like really like question that position. And I think that's what like maybe horror science fiction does the best, when like it like uses a figure like that as a way to like put you into a space that is like dystopian and dark, to then push and like question certain things that are just assumed or like taken comfortably, right? So in this case, like I think again, like thinking about crisis and like global warming and the way like that people like talk about it and discuss it, I think like it always misses the point of like who it's being like thought for, what are the resolutions for it. And I think resolution is like also very important, like the solutions or like things that people suggest as a way to deal with it, right? So like how much of that can be practiced or is practiced, let's say in like certain countries. If you're worried about like life is like getting up and like making it to the end of the day, like making money or like whatever, having access to very basic things, like how far can you go in like thinking about that and also coming up for solutions that work for you. Yeah, so and there's like so many also like more elements in connection to that. But I think again, I just like sort of wanted to use this Huma, the heat bringer, as a way to like challenge that space that I think is usually just very elitist and is very like taken comfortably in that sense.
It's wonderful always to end as we begin. So please join me in giving our guest tonight a real thank you from all of us here at BCN and Berkeley.